controllable, it is something that is a real challenge. And, when it comes right down to it, the one thing you can control is yourself. And I think that is one of the biggest challenges when we're dealing with difficult times and such, is in fact putting your own self in a position to make the best decisions. And that is what we'll try to do here today as we're pulling this together, as we look at it in light of what the perspective is. And this chart only goes up to 2003. Needless to say, and Dr. Ed Bork shared it with me a few years ago. That's why it's 2003. And with the idea that I could use it as I saw fit. So at that time, the point of all of this is that this is Edmonton and annual precipitation at Edmonton. And we see life is never neutral. It's up and down, back and forth. And the biggest problem we run into is when we run into this scenario we've got on the right side, and that is a declining first year, second year, third year, fourth year. And it simply means that it's progressively getting worse, so avoidance is much more of a challenge. And with that in mind, that was part of the study where Dr. Bork was looking at this, and I'll share pieces too as we go along to that study and what they found. The thing we always say in the farming world, it doesn't grow if it doesn't rain, is very true. And yet, the more we know about perennial forages, the more we know there's a lot of factors coming together. And Gordon Hutton said it pretty well when he said, there's management in there, and management is you. And it's because some of it's after the fact or before the fact, and we're putting pressure on ourselves. But the fact of the matter is building something and managing it so that it is strong and continues to be strong. Because one thing we know about our own landscapes, it is the one thing that we work with Mother Nature to control. And the word control in Mother Nature is never there. It is, in fact, a relationship, and we work within that relationship. When I look at everything right now, I just immediately start looking at things in light of ahead of time. And I already have talked to a neighbor about straw for the fall. I'm looking into where I can get DDGs or such from. So it's one of those things where doing things in advance and then really trying to put it together. There's no doubt, and I don't know, this year, the biggest thing I find with any of this is that it's so varied. And I know I paid $40 a straw bale, and that was a good deal down here, I guess. And they weighed, one baler baled at 850 weights. The other baler was baling at 1,000 weights, and I ended up paying $40 a bale for all of it. And then I had another arrangement with another friend, and his straw bales were over 1,100. So the point of all of this is what you take home. And it's so easy to say, well, that's my price. I'm hearing bales are selling for such and such. But the weight side gets slipped by us so many times. And because we buy feed all the time, we know, and every year there are errors on the weight side. And I'm hating to say that the majority of time, if you are looking at it, they're going to be against you. And I guess the other story is cow weight. And I know my brother who farms up at Willingdon would tell you when he weighs cows and sends them to the auction market, their weight drops by maybe in the range of 80 to 150 pounds. I heard a presentation Sean McGrath did just last week, and he said 15%. So when we're looking at bale weights, we're also looking at cow weights. When we look at auction market weights, they're not really the right weight. When we look at bale weights, they're not usually the right weight. So it's easy enough when you've bought feed and paid for a 1,500 pound bale and it's 1,300. When you're feeding a 1,200 pound cow and she's 1,450, how things can go sideways and you can run out of feed more quickly. one of the things I'd say because of this is that's why it's important to take stock of everything and well in advance start looking at alternatives. We're taking stock, and as we take stock, one of the biggest concerns in terms of what we've got coming to us is what happened to us. And Dr. Llewellyn Mansky, who's a real mentor to me, and he spoke at the Western Canadian Conference on Soil Health and Grazing when we had it a few years ago. And Karen and the Battle River Research Group are working on that for putting another one on in December. So keep your dials tuned. But from that matter, we're looking at perennial plants that very simply are going to grow and go from year to year. And as they do that, those tillers live longer than a year, but we're looking at them setting up next year's yield. And so right in advance, it's good to know, I'm going to be below normal on that field, and I'm going to have later growth coming. And Dr. Mansky is a plant phenologist, and that simply means he studies the plant growth stages and their reactions to grazing management. So there's a lot of genetics put together with what actually happens out in the field. And I went down and spent a day with him in North Dakota at the Dickinson Research Station, and I was very impressed with his pastures. So, I don't put things down lightly on a page. I go and check into them before I do. The thing about this, and he makes it a little complicated in spots, so we'll deal with it a little bit. But the fact of the matter is that, yes, it doesn't grow if it doesn't rain. But tell me more about it. Because the fact is, that's where, as Gordon Hutton had shared, they were species. And we have species, and that's one of the reasons why Karen and I and others were part of the project on higher legume pastures. Very simply, they're drought avoiders. And they even have hydraulic lift, which can lift water up from lower down in the soil profile and bring it up to the surface during the heat of the day for the afternoon, and then into the night where they release it back a bit for the grasses in there. So we're looking at a number of things with drought avoidance and management practices coming together. So it really can't be separated is the point of it. And the fact is, I think for so many of you that are on this webinar, I would just bet that you've been part of the grazing community for many years, and you know that it's just part of life to deal with some of this. The unfortunate thing about it is we've lost control of many things. What we get paid for our cattle has always been a challenge, and we always do appreciate when Cargill and JBS do wish to share some money back down the chain, which they're not right now. So the idea behind all of this is lack of control in spots. And that's where we really have to prepare ourselves, and preparing ourselves in steps so that when certain times hit and calendar dates, when we're in a drought, it's biological dates on plants, not calendar. But for ourselves, we're going to have to put calendar dates down so that we do, in fact, look at it from a standpoint of we got to take action at this point in time. I do say to people, look at all of these options as we think through it, and how do we put it together? Work was done by Dr. Bork at 3 locations. Kinsella's not so far away from you, but the idea behind it is picking a pasture that's from the parkland, one that's from the dry land areas, and that would be that one. And we're looking also at the areas that are more bush pastures. What they found with drought effects from the parkland, and that's where Forestburg would fall in, is that when moisture was reduced, yields went down. And that was a herbage reduction of around 43% due to drought. So my thought right away is, okay, that's a number I can look at and think about, 43%. Dr. Mansky looked at it and said, hold on, you just said something about management too. And we've got up and down times throughout year to year. And yes, the early spring moisture is pretty well everything in North Dakota, and to be true with you, here too. So when he said life is never 100%, what we're looking at then is looking at precipitation coming out of an average, because a lot of times we can ebb and flow, and having a little less rain doesn't turn out to be so different in yield and what happens. But what he's come up with is a bit of a tool. And the idea again is driving home a point. Okay, if we're going to be that short, 35% reduction, what are you going to do about it? And that's, we're looking 40% Ed Bork came up with. We're looking 35 in this example. Mansky came up with a reduction in precipitation. And I don't know the reduction you had in Forestburg this year. I know certainly that was a challenge. I do know one thing, that grazing management doesn't work if it's not in balance. And I know also the one thing that doesn't get met if we're not in balance is the biggest thing we need that's going to determine our long-term profitability on the farm. And that is maintaining pastures and productivity. And rest is a key point there. We have to have a balance of giving the pastures rest. And as we're doing and taking stock of this story, yes, if we're looking at a reduction, and if that pasture only gives us 15,000, which is about that 40%, and for if you needed animal days, so it could be cow days or animal days, the fact is that it's whatever you want to use, and you need 2,500. What do you do to make up for that difference? The best time to know is now, because if you don't, this will never get satisfied. And the problem with it, pasture productivity longer term is eroded. And that's the last thing we can afford when we know that we can't control what a packing plant wants to pay for feedlot animals, and we're stuck on the other end. We have to control what we can control. Back in 2001, 2002, so it tells you how old I am, I was reading this book by Stan Parsons. And if you knew Stan Parsons at all, some of us older people did, he worked with Ellen Savory. And Stan Parsons was the person that Ranching for Profit came out of. And so you had the two groups. You had the holistic management, you had the Ranching for Profit. And one thing that Stan liked to do was looking at you as a manager. And he said, okay, working in the business or working on the business. The one thing that he said that really hit home with me, in 2002 was worrying about the business. Because that is a point we could ask for hands to.
And so the idea about it was Stan Parsons is a very smart man. And I thought to myself, yes, if you're worrying, what are we going to do about it? And that is important. One of the biggest things we're going to do about it is take stock of where we are. We're going to make a bit of an estimate of the days we're going to graze. And as we're doing that, we're trying to get this balance up. We're starting to look at things. And certainly for most of us, whichever cow doesn't have a calf is going to go no matter what. If we've got replacements, maybe we're not going to keep as many. Maybe we're going to prepare to let them go. And that is why for so many people that flexible herd of yearlings fits in well, because the concern you have is that it's harder to let a core cow herd go. And I know yes, we get attached to our cows, can't help that. And I know we shouldn't, but it is hard when you're out there working with these animals over years and time. And for myself, it's a real challenge because I've still got my mom and dad's wedding cow family line in our herd as well. So you can imagine that you're attached. That's why having yearlings works well, because you can let them go. You're less attached to them than you are to somebody that you in fact have known. And if you have to keep a cow line, consider doing that. The idea behind it is we've got a place in place, and I sit there with my book and I write down this cow's got a poor udder, this cow is a little tough at calving to handle that calf, and those type of things. The biggest thing I'm going to share with you is this point, that after we've done this, this is the easiest thing to do without culling. And it is, in my mind, imperative to find more yield right away. And that, the beauty of some of these things we're going to look at is by planning and managing that growing season as we get the animal numbers in line with the potential production we think we're going to have, and have target dates when we're going to take remedial action. So drawing lines in the sand, as my cousin said to me on the weekend, on July 17th, when it rained an inch, on July 25th, he was going to let the cow herd go. So they stayed. And the idea behind that is those target dates, we're hopefully going to have a longer grazing season. But one thing I'm always looking at to build up my own morale in this time is, what can I do that is going to be productive into the future too? And that's where the excitement so many of us are finding with soils, because we know that in this system where we think we in fact have everything under control, the fact is it really isn't as much as you think. A system, as Mansky shared, as others shared, is never neutral. And that was the premise of our second grazing conference that we had back in 1998. Was Bert Smith was there, and he was the person that kept saying there's antagonism or synergism, positive synergy, negative antagonism in systems. So if you're working against Mother Nature, expect to never get that advantage you hope for. Things just don't add up. The more we get in tune with it, the more we'll find it exceeds our expectations. And this is what I do try in a situation like this last year, and I'm going to share with you some of the things that we look at and learn from experience, and how we can go into this year controlling a situation. It might be controlling it for a year and accepting the fact that we're going to lose out in the future, or maybe it isn't. Maybe it is simply control within the year. And all this shares with you if you've never seen it. And this was part of that soil food web. We're managing a bunch of things that come together or come apart. And that's what we're trying to understand, how our interactions are causing this. That is the excitement too, is that we know that photosynthesis occurs, and that can be the food for the plants and for the future of our soil organisms as they feed the soil and become more productive. And that's where Karen and I had a long chat before we even started planning this about different things that buoy up the productivity of landscapes. And one of the things certainly is looking at the management of the animals' manure and urine, and we'll get into that in a bit. But looking at it from a standpoint of importance, we know that if we can buoy up soil quality, our organic matter goes up with it. Can't help it, it does. And with that in mind, we have potential for a higher yield or a higher water holding capacity. And I know that we look at our landscapes in terms of if it rains or doesn't rain, but the reality is we still evaporate, and that's shocking, but we evaporate more water than we should. And we need to create a system. And that's where that whole managed grazing system we hear so much from the range specialists with litter and such, because yes, we're managing a system above and below ground. We're managing a system to accept the water and to infiltrate it, hold it for release later. Instead of evaporating it, evapotranspirating it back through the plant. And with all of that in mind, we can grab more water, hold more water an acre, and instead of irrigating, we're simply keeping what we have. Now, the 1 day in the spring versus 3 in the fall, everybody quotes this number and everything. And many years ago, Dwayne McCartney and I searched for the answer. Who actually said this to begin with? And actually, Hugo Gross at Brandon did. And it's interesting because we tracked it down. And when he did that, he was a meticulous man that was a scientist at Brandon. And through the findings of what he had seen, he came out with this rule of thumb. Why it's so crucial is that we have to let plants recover from winter and or dormancy in a drought where they went dormant maybe in July, August, depending on when. And the telltale for it, people say, don't start grazing until you get to such and such a point. Well, the 3 leaf per tiller is something on tame plants, 3.5 on native, that Mansky found was really important. And the other thing he found that was really bad was opening the gates in the fall. And when cattle are out there, removing those leaves off the last tillers, off plants that were inadequately recovered, the cost is in lifeblood. Sounds gory. Well, it is to a plant. It is really important if you don't have the pasture productivity to look at the situation and decide what to do and do it early, because we know the cost is into next year, starting right there and then. If we do not have 2.5 to 3 leaves on a tiller in the fall, we're going to have lower productivity in the spring. And yes, I've got pastures that didn't have 2.5 leaves on a tiller, but we managed a lot of them so we could have. And that was the point. You accept some sacrifice in any of the situations, or you're a very good manager and make decisions better than I did. But be careful, because emergency grazing during a drought shouldn't come at the expense of going into overdraft in a plant's bank account. Reason why Hugo Gross said these points was so much of what happens early, and Canada even more than happens in the US, as Mansky talked about, because he's in North Dakota. We're further north and our growing season's shorter. So the majority of our growth happens early. And as we look at that, yes, you could say, well, if it's an alfalfa stand and regrowth and potential, but we're looking at rules of thumb here. So the moisture that happens now in April and May and June, that long day of the year, June 21st, is powerfully everything. And rain we get later might help. It might help recovery, but it doesn't give us the yield that earlier moisture does. And management, as Hugo Gross said, management for the plant to be really productive. So if we get to that 3.5 leaf stage in the springtime for recovery, then we choose to simply leave a plant that's very vigorous by a light grazing. And this is a rule of thumb. So this is a perfect world. And depending on the grazing systems we have set up, we can or can't do it. But it's important for us, in my own mind, to understand some of these reasons why. Looking at that early growth, simply meaning that the last thing we want to do is really bring a plant to a halt. And why that's so important is because if we don't damage it adversely here, Mansky's work shows we even cause it to tiller more, and productivity can go up. So the amount of yield that we actually harvest, you say, oh, we're harvesting the whole thing. No, actually, we're not, because we have encouraged the plants to grow more. And with that extra growth, that might be 30% more, we can harvest a bit more. So it's something to look at with a 2-pass system. And that's what Mansky proposed in his management, was in fact timely grazing in the spring, which you can control. When are you going to turn them out? I know we can say, well, we don't have the feed, so we're going to have to turn them out. Well, just keep this in the back of your mind then. Wherever they go is coming at a cost. And how can we do it? Because we want that plant to tiller, we want green leaf area in June. And the reason it's so important is for that plant vigor and that earlier growth, because if that plant would have been left in the fall with that 2.5 to 3 leaf stage per tiller, we would find often that our spring we have earlier growth. And so when somebody says to me, well, everything's slow coming this year, yes, it could be because of cold weather or snow didn't leave or other things, but we do have earlier growth from lead tillers when we have 3 leaf, 2.5 leaf in place in the fall. And that is all heading us towards a longer growing season and then grazing, be it second cut hay or be it grazing a second time over. And yes, I didn't graze some of my pastures twice. We have pastures we only graze once. And I'll show you another pasture we graze 4 times. So we'll talk about that. But the reason why it's so important, and Dr. Bork put this down, is because we're looking at that very early time in spring slow growth. As we build that solar panel, when we come in and manage it during this time span with a quarter or half removal, we're still in a rapid growth position. And I'll share that a little more. The ability for that plant to regrow fast, to give us that better growth biomass that we're really looking for, comes from trying to maintain a plant that gets past its recovery. It's now kicking into the operating loan in this stage, but it's not in overdraft. If we graze it in here, we're putting it in a position of stopping it and topping out the operating loan. And then our next grazing is going to be an overdraft. So deferring grazing in the spring, be very careful with it, allow for that maximum growth so that it can deal with the moisture stress and come at you positively. The reason it's so important, back in the 50s, Kreider did some really good work, and he showed the fact that, and he looked at smooth brome, he looked at crested wheatgrass, and I can't remember the other two, green needlegrass, and I can't remember the third. Maybe it was western wheatgrass. But the point of that is that when we graze less than 50%, so this plant had 40% grazed because 60% was left, the root growth on that plant was minimally affected. 50%, not affected really at all. So when I'm grazing a third or a quarter, I'm leaving a plant with deep roots to bounce back and keep coming at me. And with that in mind, giving me the deep roots I need when the ground gets drier, and giving me the tillers and green leaves that I need versus a seed head. And that's the goal Mansky has with his system, to change your plant's thinking from a hay plant that puts up a head. And this is really true of pasture plants like meadow brome, orchard grass, tall fescue, Kentucky bluegrass, creeping red fescue, and those type of plants, western wheatgrass and others. It's less true of things like smooth brome, but the more quackgrass actually fits in here well too. The reason why it's important is if we run into a drought with this drought-induced situation, when we had, in fact, a drought imposed, our roots were adversely affected. Well, the last thing we want to do is add to a problem. And it's just natural for a plant in drought to kind of say, suck it up, princess, we're going to take care of ourselves. If we don't, we're going to find that we're going to be in trouble down the line. So anyway, Shorty I just pulled that up to make sure. Shorty just had a good comment there. The August rains are really important. The fall rains and yes, we got, I believe, half of our rainfall in September and October, latter part of August. to take advantage of that, setting up those plants for next year. And if plants have got enough vigor in them and everything, they can set themselves up quite nice. I had a person call me and he said, Grant, the pastures are coming back. I can see them coming. What do you think I should do on this? And as we strategized it with him, he was down at Vulcan, so drier area. Our thought to it was, let's start feeding earlier, because those pastures are going to be really good pastures in the springtime to get out there earlier on. So the thing I'm going to look at here is a bit of pasture planning. This was a workbook put out by the West Central Forage Association. It's still on their site, if I'm not mistaken. They revamped it in 2017. But the idea behind it is, in my mind, emphasizing a point of control and grouping animals too. When we start looking at rotational grazing, as some people called it, they said you can get about 30% more grazing days. Well, the fact is I can't say that, but I will say this, that if it's going to give us any more, this is the year we want it. I will say to myself, after the first cycle, I'm going to run all those cows together. I'm not going to keep the second cycle calves anyway. I don't care who's bred to who. And with that in mind, I can get away with a little line breeding if I had to this year. But each of these systems being the same size, but when you look at them, you realize that these plows walk and check everything out. These cows have no choice but to check out a very small area. All of these other pastures are in a position for recovery, rest. And that is the importance of having many pastures and systems. And at times it's a challenge, but we can send cows down the road in terms of driving them, moving them from pasture to pasture, or maybe it's just a question of running them with a bigger group and running them with multiple sires and accepting some of the disadvantages. Because do we really this year have to have everything known? If we're looking at our future and where we come out with it, I'd rather, instead of knowing that 3/4 of the time my pastures are rested, maybe 96% of the time my pastures are rested. The pasture they're in, and why this gets you more grazing days, is interesting, because cows are not haybinds. And if we hold them there a long time, McKinney, when he looked at this is what he was finding, what cows were doing. Yeah, at times they were grazing parts of plant if we graze it. And you look at this over, okay, this is grazed lightly. Well, that plant didn't think so. When this is grazed moderately, then you start looking around, oh, well, still. So the point of all of that is that animals and control of animals and how they graze, so that you can get that extra yield. And you say, I don't want to get into this business of moving cows and everything. Maybe it's 1 year you do it. Maybe it's because the kids are home for the summer, you can do it. I don't know. My thought to it is everybody's got their own situation. And I had hired help this summer. So we were out there moving cows on a pasture, and I'll show you every 2 days. And you'd think, why would you do that? Well, because the writing was on the wall from the start of the year. Things were not good. And in my own mind, I wanted to get a grazing season that was a long growing season. The only way I can do it is to let those plants grow mass. And yes, they didn't grow as well, but the mass they grew. The biggest thing here, when we start looking at advantages I've got in green, is if we're going to recover from drought, why wouldn't we want higher forage production? The use per acre, my point here is, yes, I got greater use per acre, but I got them in there, got them out of there. And with that, the stocking rates typically could be increased. And a stocking rate is looking at the overall picture. This one is density. And for that matter, Karen, did you have a question?
Yes,
Nope.
sir. David, he asks, how does one decide when a pasture needs to be worked and reseeded?
When a pasture needs to be worked and reseeded is personal to everyone, I guess. What I'm looking at is I don't have the species that I started with at all. So I'm taking stock of what I've got out in the pasture. I'm looking at health, but I'm also looking at species. And when I see that all the species have changed from when I seeded it, that's the first. It doesn't mean I have to, but it's the first thing. Oh, okay. So now I'm dealing with, and when we have learned enough to say, you know what, I wouldn't do it that way. I wish I wouldn't have done it that way. I'm now changing how I'm doing things. So, Karen, the key point to David's thing is change. I am changing the way I'm doing things because, as the old saying goes, you got to where you got. So, what are you going to do different so you don't get there again? And so that's the other thing where we have found places where people have taken some grazing courses, realized that, you know what, I'm getting comfortable with electric fencing. I now realize I can do some things. I put up some fences, and now I've got an opportunity to use some of my new knowledge. And I've been to this workshop, that workshop. This is how I'm going to do it. So now bring in change, because change will have more of a duration and addressing the weakest link. And that is the pasture that is probably the one that's evolved the most away from what you wanted. The thing I'll move on then for now, but I'm also looking at manure, and why that's important is going to be shared in a minute. And again, other options. So advantages, I'm looking at that 1 + 1 = 3. So where can I find more options within my own system, within my own land base? And if you're comfortable with electric fencing in some way, if you're not, there are many people out there that Karen can set you up with to get some pointers from. And electric fencing, as people will say, if you don't think it's going to work for you, it won't. If you think it's going to work for you, it will. And so electric fencing is a great opportunity. When you look at this, you see this pasture, and it is pretty much hammered. You'd almost think, well, that's my pasture. So you think I shouldn't be proud of it. But we're looking at something here. This was grazed severely with a short duration grazing. And there was enough mass there that you could get all these cow pies. When I looked at the fertilizer prices, and I used Alberta Agriculture's prices in December for nitrogen and phosphorus. I didn't have potassium and sulfur. I put potassium and sulfur in at about $900 a ton. And I had my nitrogen at about $11.50 a ton, my phosphorus at $12.50 a ton for $12.51. That's the kind of fertilizer value was coming net to the soil. That's why I want to know where my manure is going. I don't want it in the dugout or in the trees. I want it back on the landscape. And yes, this has been severely grazed, but when a cow's fecally depositing 8 to 9 times, urinating 11 to 16, I've got a situation where I am fertilizing this pasture pretty well and with prices. The other thing I do look at is I look at around and take stock. I've got pastures on our place we call the beaver pond. And the beaver pond's not a fun place to be. But the idea behind it, it is also a drought insurance for me. And if I need to, and because aspen's encroaching and moving more into some of these places, and this isn't the beaver pond, it's just an example, but we put the cattle through here last year, and I pushed back these tiny seedlings that were coming because I didn't want them. And you can see a cow on the other side. So we divided it, put the cows in there, grazed this severely as we move through. So now I've got my 1 + 1. I'm cutting back on brush that I didn't want. The other one is riparian areas where everybody says you shouldn't graze riparian, you should take care of them and everything. Okay, you know what? I'll take care of them until I have to use them. And this area, if you could see, the cows didn't appreciate it too much, but we pushed them right into the cattails. And depending on how mature the cattails are, you've got about a 50 TDN, about a 6-7% crude protein. So not really enough for cow lactating. But if they were only in here as they were for 2 days, 3 days, we got that much grazing out of this piece that we wouldn't have found elsewhere on the farm. So all of a sudden, we got 2 to 3 days grazing on poorer quality forages, and maybe you have to supplement or do other things. But the reality of using this riparian area as a resource, I should have put him in here first thing in the spring. The key was it was dry. I wasn't going to pug it or anything. So I certainly don't want to be putting them in really wet areas where they're going to damage the soil integrity and other things. But I knew those cattails have been there for years, as you can see the further advanced, and there's a water pond in here. That's why the cattails are there, and we kept the cattle out of there. But the point of it is that we got all this grazing through here that we wouldn't have had, and it ended up being around 90 cow-calf days per acre. Oh, going the wrong way. And somebody will say, well, you got to have good fences. Well, no, you just run a hot wire inside. And I had a hard job doing it, but I did it with the quad inside, and I put it low enough to keep the calves in. And so the idea of holding those cattle out of the ditch and everything and forcing them to stay in and graze that area, the point of all of that to me is what I call equal and opposite. That area had never been grazed hard. It was grazed very little, if at all. And all of a sudden, I was hard on it. But I was hard on it in a way that I call equal in opposite measure. I grazed it very severely because it had been this way for a long time. Now I know it's the most resilient place on the farm because once every 5 years, 10 years, it has something happen like that to it. It's certainly an opportunity for me to buy 3 days and that I wouldn't have had otherwise and give pastures 3 days more rest. Yes, it's a hassle. And here's our quad. You know, we use lifters for wire. And yes, we got cows trained to electric fence and they're really well trained. That's the reality of our setup. And we put a wire around here, though it's a real hassle, because we knew that we could separate them from the area they liked more, force them in the area they liked less. And with that in mind, this is the area that we push them through and they graze severely. This is in September and the grass is coming back. It never did get to 2.5 leaves, but it was about 1.5 leaves coming back. And now, yes, we're on to another area and they're moved every 2 days. You can see they're pretty tight. And the idea behind it is, no, this didn't have the quality. But when I cut the check for the guy this fall, it actually was pretty close to last year. And the premise behind that is that, in fact, we've got a situation. If I need to, I'll use urea and mineral or other things to buoy up crude protein. I do find when you move cattle every 2 days or something, you know, they move from, they will seem to carry a little more protein shortfalls well and still keep on going. And so that's just a better picture of the scenario. So yes, this is all mature and you can see how we fenced. This was simply fenced based on the fact that this forage was a sedge or a water-loving grass that'll flood at times, and areas where the cows, and all those manure pies, you can't see them so well anymore, right? This was coming back slow because we'd hit it hard. This is a Solnetzik quarter. It's got hard pan in all the upper areas. So we still got grazing days that we wouldn't have had otherwise. The other thing that made me feel better at times, I ate the cattails there, is what am I going to do with my weeds? Instead of spraying them out and everything, if I've got weeds, maybe I'm going to force the cows to eat them. And yes, when we bale graze, if we've got thistles on the landscape to begin with, we will have more thistles after bale grazing. This is straw. So we've got a lot of waste on the straw. We push the animals accordingly. This is the paddock we used the heifers on in the winter. So we didn't ask them to eat the straw as much as we would on a cow herd. But you can see the thistles in August and how they graze them. So it got us a few days there again as we controlled weeds. And there's some Kathy Voth and the work she did at Livestock for Landscapes. She does an excellent job on teaching animals to eat weeds. And I taught many animals many, many years ago, and I haven't come back to it. I need to do more. But that cow line knows how to eat thistles better, and that one, than some of these other cows, because they were her mother was one that got trained 13 years before. So it's a long time. And yes, water, how do you get water there and everything? Maybe it's a case where you haul it. And you know what? We got 144 cow days per acre grazing our ditch. We grazed it all along. So you can see, I always said to Karen, I always tell people, say as I say, don't do as I do. Because at home, my fences only have to be good enough. And at times when I don't rely too heavily on them, they doesn't take them too long. They're not very good, but it works. And so someday I'm going to replace it. But the point is, I grazed that ditch severely to get me grazing days. And I did it so this would come back. And I got 140 cow days an acre. So if I had 144 cows, I'd have grazed it one day. If I had 50 cows, I'd have gone out there and grazed it maybe 3 days. Maybe I had to haul water from. Maybe I talked a deal in with my neighbor and he put a tank out for me for a short period of time because he felt sorry for me. And I know there are, certainly our county says you're not supposed to graze ditches, but I go from the opinion that I'll ask for forgiveness. And we kept a wire pretty low in that ditch so that the calves wouldn't get out. And it's an upper area facing up. Go ahead, Karen.
Sorry to interrupt, but I had another question for you. Jim was asking, going back to the riparian area there, he's asked, did you graze the actual cattail plants at all?
Yes. Okay. Yeah, we grazed the cattail plants, and the cattails were the closest in. So that would have been cattails through here. And yet it falters as it comes through. That would have been cattails. So yes, we grazed the I've grazed cattails before when they're immature, and even in spring, then they're really good comparatively. Once they're got the heads on them, they're not good, and you just okay, whatever. But yeah, the fact of the matter is, yes, we did graze the cattail plants. And as I said, if you look through the Manitoba emergency feeding, they'll tell you that they were about 50 TDN and about 6% crude protein. So that's what they found in the study. One of the advantages, and Karen and I talked about bale grazing or bale shredding on the land, just getting everything out there. One of the biggest advantages we've got when the work was done, when we're out on the landscape versus manure being put on the landscape, hauled back or such, we found with the work Paul Youngnitz did at Saskatoon that 35 to 45% of our nitrogen got recaptured when animals urinated on a pasture, and that was ammonia in our minds. When we haul the manure back out, it's only 1 to 3%. That is a lot different. So if we're looking at high value of fertilizers we did earlier, that's the kind of growth you can get at times on it. And once we started to look at some of this isn't the same piece, but I'll show you a piece in a second. This piece was hailed out barley was fed on it. And this was taken in, I think it was coming into August, but all said and done, the amount of, I'm saying something wrong. This, the yellow barley's on this side. But the idea of this is look at the green and how well it's coming back. This piece here was where the calves were fed. And so with the bales that we've got placed on here, and the density of the bales, yeah, we're putting on about 1,200 pounds an acre of nitrogen. That's a lot, right? And this area got grazed 4 times when the dust cleared. That area on the other side of the fence only had a third removal, and the cattle never came back. So the difference fertility makes on the land and managing, yes, the cows can't bale graze everything, but like I said, that's an important one. Remember, 35 to 45% recapture of nitrogen versus hauling manure back and putting it on the land and getting 1 to 3. And yes, I know there are times, this is into August, and we still have patches, and this is another straw piece. So the cows were bale grazing straw on this piece, and this is the cow herd. So we forced the cow herd harder versus the heifers and young cows. But the exciting thing about it is where I had legumes, I'm going to tell you right now, I don't find putting legume seed on first and then bale grazing on top doesn't seem to work for me. I was talking to another of my friends at Consort, it doesn't work. I know there was an adopt project in Saskatchewan and it didn't work, but I do know that if there were legumes previously, they will come back. And here we've got red and L-site clover in there. So in areas where there wasn't as much straw and areas where this vigorous plant is going to grow and spread out. And this piece was grazed twice and quite severely. Why? Because it had the vigor to take it. Now I'm going to move into annual forages. Go ahead, Karen.
Okay, before we have another question here. Do you float your pasture right after you pull the cows or sheep off?
No, I don't float it. I tried many, many years ago, and for me, it doesn't work at all. You've got to have a much broader density where you've got lots of room to move material over. And at the same time, it doesn't break down as fast because now you've simply creating material that's not connected to the soil as much. So I leave what I've got. And at times when it snowed quite a bit and the animals are eating, they will spread the bale over the snow and create ice under it. And that's when I lose my legumes or bunch grasses like meadowbrome. I will lose because of the ice. And if cows are grazing bales when there's no snow on the ground or very little, then you don't have the ice. You don't have the big setback in spring. And in fact, then the ground warms up faster. And we've cut hay in June on a piece that had been bale grazed without harrowing it or moving things around. So in my own mind, I got them too tight a density. If you've got them farther apart, it might work for you. All right, moving on to annual forages. That is a big thing to look at right now because the reality is if things don't add up and your numbers show they don't add up, what are you going to do? If you have the land base to plant, and I know you can look around and say, well, look at the price of grain. I know. Do you want to sell the cows down? That is really something to look at. In my own mind, we know. And we'll look at a spring-winter mix of seed. And it's really important in my own mind, if I'm growing annual forages, to get out there early because I want to take advantage of the early spring moisture that, if any snow melts, provide and such. And an oat or barley crop, and we'll get there in a second, and will grow the fastest, but it also gives those perennial pastures a chance to rest. Maybe you get across them with a light graze and then you give them to rest, or maybe there's some pastures that you use too much in the fall, and that's where you really try to buy yourself time. Arvid Austin put this together, and when he did, yes, the fall seeded winter cereal could be the best. And I know I had clients at Union Forage, but we had others that were looking at planting a winter cereal in the fall and doing so the last week of August, 1st September or earlier. And why? Because in the spring, it's going to come really early. Barley comes, and in fact, when you look at barley here, it's early growth, quick growth, oats too. So in 6 weeks' time, you get this growth. Oats can regrow a little better than barley, but in a drought situation, it varies because a lot of tillers are not expressed. So they will regrow. And that's the reason we get silage crops coming off early with maturity and yet regrowth occurring. Well, there was a lot of dormant tiller buds that now express themselves. And the reason we look at a winter cereal in the mix, because we're looking to keep our average going. Be very careful. Italian ryegrass needs water if it doesn't have water. So we're better off sticking with winter cereals and putting an oat barley with a winter cereal so that we get an annual that grazes all summer. The point here, and this is where so many people are going to, is they're starting to think a little broader too. They're integrating livestock, as you would be in the other example. And the one thing is they're looking at more than one plant species. And they're looking at it for a number of reasons. And when one of the scientists at the Peace Country Beef and Forage Association in Fairview, Dr. Akeem Obenkanye, looked at it. He found that in general, if you didn't fertilize at all, so that's a careful one, if you didn't fertilize at all, putting 3 of these together to consider. So you had a diversity of 3. And why? Because they did different things. If you're using a nitrogen fixer, I'm going to tell you right now, the strongest it's going to be a pea, something that's an annual nitrogen fixer. A sweet clover is a biannual, so a lot of people look to it because it's a tough one. And they often plant it with a winter cereal. But the idea behind some of this is if you're going to play with this, think it through carefully. And I'm not saying it is something to do. I'm saying it's something to consider. And if you're looking at 1 + 1 = 3, that's where some people are doing things. And I know that last year, Khalil and the Battle River Research Group had a trial with cocktails and mixtures. So you'd have to tap into them to find out how their yields were and how it did. But they're looking at different functions of plants. And as the plants come together with different functions, the cereals that are so common to us, then the nitrogen fixers, because it's high-priced fertility of nitrogen, and the root crops, in fact, maybe that are going to allow for water infiltration to be better. The hairy vetch, the peas that are present, things that are going to have a taproot. Yes, there is a place in the picture. A Phacelia that's a pollinator, maybe that isn't the year for it. But sticking with something that works. Do not go hopping around grabbing something that doesn't have a core of what works in your area. You and I know we can't afford the risk this year. So we stick with still quite a bit of what we know. Oats, maybe spring trit, barley, whatever you've got in the bin. A warm season plant, be very careful. I do not see warm seasons as something to play with unless you want to play with them. And sunflower does reasonably well, but the fact of the matter is adding it to a mix is simply something if you have the money to do and you want to see what a 4th component brings. Stick with what works first. And if you're short of money, stick with the cereals. And if you're seeding cereals with pulses, you got to cut the cereals back to about 50%, pulses to 75%. So 50 plus 75 equals 125. So you decide. You got to allow for a home for some of these species or don't bother for them. And the thing about it is you can choose. And when, okay, I ran out of pasture, what do I do? And down here at Vulcan, the Robinsons decided they were going to graze it. Instead of swath graze it, they're going to graze it in the fall. If they got extra left over, it's going to go to swath grazing. The thing I can look at with this too is if you get the growth, and this is at Acme, and many of you know Jim Bauer, and the idea what Jim had here is he did not get the growth he wanted because he did not have the moisture, and that's why you be very careful picking species that need more moisture to grow. And there are some brassicas that grow well with lower moisture, but what Jim did instead is he put the yearlings out on it as a supplement. Then back to the yard they came for a poor quality hay ration. So he'd use the dog or the horses and pull them in and back. And this was right after weaning for a period of time. All I wanted to show is you can do a lot of things with lowland and lifting to get cattle into or out of places. And the animals had come to here, and then we lifted up the fence and sent them further on. So this was an area they had to walk back to water. Yeah, I would have liked that they didn't, but at the same time, they were on this piece only 7 days in total. And this was at the end of the 7. I should have said it was maybe the 3 days. So it's 10 days in total. So they walked back to water. Now they're on the side, and this fence is going to drop. So they can't come back here, but they have to walk back for water. And in the end, we put them on the shoulders of the area, forced them to graze the forages they didn't like, got the grazing days we were looking for, badly needing, used the opportunity to, with well-trained cows, the beauty of what they'll do for you. So take advantage of a low area, kind of think, how can I? Well, I don't want to be feeding them, so I can do it. The other thing I found, it's always 1 + 1 = 3. We actually did have seed set on some of the clover by August 30th. So we grazed it lightly in the spring, and then we hadn't come back because we were trying to buy time. And then we even had some clover seeding. I'm wrapping up, Karen, so I'm coming right down the home stretch. The big thing I think in all of this is it's still a question of putting things in priority. And I got to admit, I want everybody on the same page. And I'll show you my thought on that is we can do lots of things, and that is important. Do them in pencil. Monitoring, once you've developed tactical steps to follow, and acting when you need to. And with anything, it's done in pencil. People say, why do you put a plan together? It never works. But you know what? You're a lot better off in the end than you were if you didn't. And that worrying about the business, it even helps me feel like I was looking at all these options and thinking, okay, I can buy time, I can buy time, I can buy time, with all these grazing of weeds and grazing of brush and grazing of ditch. And all of that to me was buying me also peace of mind. So the thing that cannot be overlooked too is draw on your Forage and Applied Research Association. Karen would say to you maybe, okay, if you're looking to do that, I know, I'll pick on Elgar Grindy because he's a good friend of mine. Elgar and Annie have been doing that for a while. Give them a phone call. They're a longtime member of Battle River, and chances are they'll give you some pointers on what to do. And we're pretty blessed in the agriculture community that when we humbly ask for opinions or helps, we've got these wonderful people like Elgar and Annie to do so. But anyway, it is so important that we do everything we can. And though I grazed severely and I wasn't proud of myself, I try to mitigate long-term damage is my point. And we're trying also to do everything we can so the animal will have good water. So if we're running out, it's still good. The portable fencing side, and really targeting areas where they have the vigor and picking them to pick on. And somebody will say, well, how can I? There's no water there. You know what? I think I can haul water for 3 or 4 or 5 days or a week. It's a real hassle, but I can buy time. And if that's what I'm doing to buy time, if I'm going to feed extra, it's going to be in the early spring when I can buy time. That is a big time. And that's the point of this. In my mind, if we're going to put expense into it, but the other thing is be realistic. If you don't have the animals, or you don't have, the pasture for the animals, don't keep them. And I hated to do it, but I did keep the cows. I let everything go I could and could have let more go. But the bad udders and other things, I let go in the fall. And $515 a cow is not much to write home about. But I keep telling myself my first loss is my best loss. At least I might have some feed inventory carried over. I'm preparing for next year and the concerns I have. And I'm getting a herd that is maybe more of the yearlings, or they'll be going. The big thing in all of that is manage yourself so that you also can get away for a bit. Doesn't have to cost lots. My daughter, we got out to the hills, and the idea, whenever I got too stressed, we pack up the trailer, go out for the weekend. It's only 2 days, I know, but at least you can do things with family. You can do things that you enjoy, and it keeps your mind fresh instead of wore out.